welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. I woke up one morning in my late 30s and realized I'd been living with a quiet, stubborn question for most of my life, the kind that doesn't announce itself as a question at all. It hides behind ordinary choices. It rides along with your laughter, with what you avoid, with what you insist doesn't matter. For me, it was a feeling I couldn't name when I was young, a sense that the word in me had edges I kept bumping into, like a room I'd been told was my size when it clearly wasn't. I want to tell this as honestly as I can, not because my story is unusual in the dramatic way people expect, but because it was ordinary in the way people rarely talk about. I'm not telling it to shock anyone, and I'm not interested in turning identity into a spectacle. I'm telling it because there are many people walking around with a private sense of mismatch, and because learning to live with yourself should not require secrecy, cruelty, or shame. When I was a kid, there were rules I absorbed like gravity. Some were spoken out loud, like say please, and don't track mud, and look people in the eye. The ones that shaped me most weren't spoken that clearly. They were delivered by the weight of silence and the heat in adults' faces when you drifted too close to something they considered wrong. Boys were supposed to be a certain way, and girls were supposed to be a certain way, and the world looked calmer when everyone stayed in their assigned lanes. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. My house wasn't cruel, but it was the kind of house where dignity was the preferred emotion. My father was the sort of person who believed love was proven by hard work and reliability. My mother carried the invisible job of making everything feel normal, even when it wasn't. They didn't talk about identity the way people do now. They didn't have language for it. If anything, they had language for what not to become: weak, strange, a target. They wanted me safe. They wanted me respectable. They wanted me happy in a way they could recognize. The first time I remember the feeling I'm talking about, I was in a bedroom that wasn't mine, at a cousin's house, where everything felt slightly unfamiliar and therefore slightly more possible. There was a laundry basket in the corner and an open closet. My cousin and I were playing some silly game that had no real rules until he ran off to the living room for snacks. I should have followed. Instead, I stood in front of the closet and looked at a row of clothes that were not meant for me. I didn't think of it as girls' clothes, not in the moral way adults meant. I thought of it as fabric, color, shape, and a kind of softness that my own clothes didn't have. My clothes were practical, like I was always expected to be prepared for work even as a child. I reached out and touched a sleeve. It felt like crossing a line that existed only in my head. My pulse did something it didn't usually do. I didn't feel aroused, not in any way like that. I didn't even have that kind of mind yet. It was closer to awe, mixed with fear, mixed with a curiosity so bright it made the room feel sharper. I didn't put anything on that day. I didn't need to. Touching it was enough to plant a small seed of awareness. There was an entire range of expression that I could see but wasn't allowed to try. The seed didn't grow into one clear desire. It grew into a contradiction. I liked the idea of softness, of deliberate presentation, of something ornamental rather than purely functional, and I also liked being praised for being tough, and easygoing, and not a problem. I learned quickly which parts of me got rewarded. In school, I became good at reading people. I learned what earned laughter, what earned approval, what made teachers relax. I learned the social posture of being a boy, not too interested in appearance, not too expressive with the hands, not too careful about anything that could be mocked as vain. I don't mean I turned into a stereotype. I mean I developed a survival skill. I could feel when someone was about to decide what I was, and I learned to manage that moment. The cost of that skill was that I stopped asking myself questions. When you're young, you can treat avoidance as maturity. You can call it, not making a big deal out of things. I did that for years. I became the kind of person who could be relied on, who didn't ask for much, who wore neutral colors, who kept his hair simple, who laughed at jokes he didn't find funny because it seemed safer than pausing and asking why the joke existed. People liked me. I liked that they liked me. And still, there were moments. A school play where I watched the girls backstage adjust their costumes and felt a strange envy that wasn't about wanting to be them, exactly, but about wanting to have permission to care. A formal event where the boys showed up in the same variations of dark suit, and the girls arrived in outfits that were allowed to be expressive. A day I caught myself staring at someone's posture, the way they moved with intention, the way they seemed to inhabit their body like it was theirs rather than an obligation. I tried to make the feelings small by giving them small explanations. I told myself I was just observant. I told myself I liked aesthetics. I told myself I was simply curious. All of those things were true, but they weren't the whole truth. By the time I left home, I had become skilled at being a version of myself that would never embarrass anyone. It's an easy trap to fall into if you love your family and don't want to cause trouble. I went to college, started working, built the beginning of an adult life with the steady patience of someone stacking bricks. I dated, not constantly but sincerely. I had relationships where I tried hard to be good. I learned how to share space, how to apologize, how to show up. And yet, whenever the topic of gender expression came up in conversation, my body reacted before my mind could. I'd feel a heat in my face, a tightening in my chest, as if the subject were a spotlight and I were standing too close to it. If someone made a joke about a man in a dress, I'd laugh politely and then feel hollow afterward, like I'd agreed to something I didn't want to agree to. If someone talked about being real men and real women, I'd nod as if that language had no effect on me, while my thoughts quietly backed away. I didn't have a crisis. I had a slow, accumulating fatigue. The kind that comes from carrying a small secret that isn't one thing you can confess and be done with. It was more like a habit of hiding, a constant recalibration, a careful editing of my own personality. The relationship that changed everything began in the most unremarkable way. I met my partner through friends. They were smart, curious, kind in a way that wasn't soft, and observant in a way that felt almost dangerous at first because I'd spent so long avoiding being seen too clearly. I'll call them Maya, not because that's their real name but because it feels respectful to give them a name that doesn't invite people to search for them. Maya didn't perform affection as a script. They asked questions like they meant them. They noticed when I went quiet. They didn't force me to talk, but they didn't let me hide behind jokes forever either. Being with them felt like standing in cleaner air. We moved in together after a couple of years, not with dramatic declarations but with the practical logic of two people who liked sharing mornings. Our home wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We argued sometimes the way all couples do, about dishes, about timing, about how each of us handled stress. The argument that mattered most, the one that set the theme of my life into motion, started with something stupid. It was one of those evenings where everything feels slightly off. I'd had a hard day at work, one where I'd swallowed frustration until it turned into irritability. Maya had had their own exhausting day. We were both thin-skinned. I snapped about something small, and they snapped back, and suddenly we were in a teasing argument that had a sharp edge underneath. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't harmless either. The kind of exchange where you're both joking and also both testing, where you're both saying, "Are you going to respect me right now?" At some point, Maya leaned against the counter, crossed their arms, and said, half amused and half serious, "You know what you need? A punishment system. Something for when you misbehave." I remember laughing because the phrase sounded ridiculous, like something from a sitcom. I said something like, "Oh, yeah, what, you're going to ground me?" And Maya, without missing a beat, tilted their head and said, "No. You're going to dress up, and you're going to surrender control for the evening. Because you get stubborn when you're stressed, and you act like you're the only one who has pressure. If you want to be sharp with me, then you can spend the evening practicing how to be gentle." The air changed when they said it. Not because the idea was inherently sexual, but because it touched a place in me that I'd spent years pretending was empty. I felt my stomach drop. I felt my mind race to categorize what had just happened. Was this a joke? A test? A random comment that meant nothing? Maya's face was calm, but their eyes were watching me the way a person watches someone who is about to either laugh freely or retreat behind a wall. I tried to laugh it off. I said, "You're insane." Maya shrugged. "Maybe. But it would make a point. You'd have to slow down. Pay attention. Be mindful. You'd have to stop stomping through the world like it owes you silence." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I stood there feeling like a door had opened to a room I'd been avoiding, and now I had to decide whether to look inside. That night, we cooled off, talked like adults, apologized for the way we'd spoken. We went to bed. The next morning, I expected the idea to disappear, to be filed under things said in a weird mood. It didn't. Over breakfast, Maya said, casually, I wasn't entirely joking, you know. I felt my heart speed up. I asked, carefully, what exactly do you mean? They didn't smirk. They didn't turn it into a performance. They spoke like they were describing an experiment in household organization. I mean, sometimes you need a reset. A way to interrupt a pattern. And I think you'd benefit from practicing presentation and etiquette. Posture. Tone. Listening. Not because those things are feminine or masculine, but because they require self-control. I stared at my coffee like it had answers. I said, and the dressing up part? Maya looked at me for a long moment. I think it would challenge you in a way you can't brute force. And, they added, slower, I think you might not hate it as much as you think. I felt exposed, but also strangely relieved. Not because the conversation was easy. It wasn't. But because it acknowledged something without naming it as shame. Maya wasn't accusing me of being wrong. They weren't mocking. They were offering a structure. I want to be clear about what happened next, because it would be easy to misinterpret it, and I don't want to contribute to anyone else's confusion. This did not become an erotic game. It did not become a secret life of thrills. It became, oddly, a form of self-study. It was intimate in the emotional sense, it required trust, consent, and honesty. It involved clothing, yes, and it involved me relinquishing a certain kind of control, but it was about behavior and identity, not about sex. We set rules, because without rules it would have been messy and possibly harmful. We agreed it would never be used in anger. We agreed either of us could pause it. We agreed it would never be used to humiliate me in public. We agreed it would be private, respectful, and focused on growth. The word punishment stayed mostly as a joke between us, but it became a shorthand for a reset ritual. When I fell into a pattern of dismissiveness or stubborn pride, I would choose to participate in an evening of structured practice. The first evening we tried it, I was so nervous I felt almost sick. Maya had gone shopping earlier in the week with a practical purpose, not with giggly excitement. They brought home a few items that were simple and understated, a soft cardigan, a pair of dark, well-fitted trousers that weren't explicitly gendered but were styled differently than mine, a pair of flat shoes that forced me to walk with more awareness. There was also a subtle necklace, the kind that looked like a small decision rather than a statement. When Maya laid the items out, my throat tightened. I realized I was afraid of what it meant, afraid of what I would feel, afraid of what I had avoided for decades. I also felt a flicker of anticipation that made me angry at myself because it threatened the story I'd told about who I was. Maya spoke gently. This is not about you becoming someone else. It's about you noticing how you occupy space. Put these on, and then we'll do a few lessons. That's it. I went to the bedroom and closed the door. My hands shook as I changed. The fabric felt unfamiliar, not because it was extravagant, but because it asked something of me, attention. I stood in front of the mirror and saw myself in clothes that altered my silhouette just enough to disrupt my automatic self-image. I looked like me, but not like the version of me I'd performed. I expected to feel ridiculous. I expected to feel shame. I did feel a version of both, but underneath there was something else, a quiet calm that startled me. It felt like my body, for once, was not being treated as purely functional. I noticed my shoulders. I noticed the way I stood. I noticed my face. When I came out, Maya didn't laugh. They didn't clap. They looked at me like I was a person they cared about. They said, "Thank you for trying." That sentence alone changed the night. It made it about choice, not coercion. The first lesson was posture. Maya stood behind me, not touching me, and asked me to stand with my weight evenly distributed, shoulders relaxed, chin level. They explained how posture isn't about pretending to be someone proper. It's about respect, for yourself and for the people in the room. When you slouch, you're telling the world you don't expect to be heard. When you puff up, you're telling the world you expect to dominate. A neutral posture, they said, is the posture of mutual dignity. Then they taught me how to walk more quietly. Not like a performance, but like someone who isn't trying to announce themselves. It was harder than I expected. My usual walk was efficient, heavy, like I was always late. Slowing down felt like surrendering my right to hurry, and that made me realize how much I used speed as armor. We did etiquette next, but not in the stiff, old-fashioned way people imagine. Maya had me practice greeting them without sarcasm. They had me practice listening without preparing a rebuttal. They had me practice apologizing without adding excuses. They asked me to set the table carefully, to pay attention to small comforts. I felt, at moments, like a child being taught again how to be human. I also felt, embarrassingly, a kind of pleasure. Not because I was being punished, but because I was being guided. I had spent so long thinking strength meant self-sufficiency that it felt almost radical to let someone else set the pace. It made me aware of how controlling I could be without even noticing, how I used competence to avoid vulnerability. When the evening ended, I changed back into my usual clothes and felt a strange sadness, as if I were leaving something unfinished. Maya noticed. They didn't comment. They simply asked, "How do you feel?" I wanted to say, "Fine," the way I always did. Instead, I said, "Confused." Maya nodded like that was acceptable. Good. Confusion means you're paying attention. Over the next months, the system became more structured, not because Maya demanded it but because I asked for it in small, hesitant ways. Sometimes I would catch myself about to snap, and I would pause and say, "I think I need a reset." Maya would look at me with a mix of warmth and seriousness and ask, "Are you choosing this?" And I would answer yes, and the yes would feel like a muscle I was learning to use. The lessons evolved. We added small practices, breathing before responding, noticing tone, speaking more slowly when I was defensive. The clothing stayed understated. Maya never pushed me toward anything extreme, and I never wanted that. What I wanted was to explore the part of me that had always been curious about presentation, about softness, about intentionality, without turning it into a joke. I started to realize something that made me uncomfortable. The punishment system wasn't shaping me into someone I wasn't. It was peeling away a rigid performance I'd built out of fear. It wasn't making me less of a man, if that word even matters in the way I used to think it did. It was making me more of myself. That realization didn't arrive as a triumphant moment. It arrived as a series of small griefs. I grieved the years I'd spent policing myself. I grieved the way I'd laughed along with jokes that reinforced fear. I grieved the boy I'd been, standing in front of a closet, feeling awe and then learning to bury it. And I also felt fear, because naming something makes it real. Once I admitted to myself that I enjoyed certain forms of gender expression, I had to ask what that meant. Did it mean I was transgender? Did it mean I was not? Did it mean I was queer? Did it mean nothing at all? I realized I'd been living under the assumption that any deviation required a complete new label, as if human beings could only exist in neat categories. Maya didn't try to label me. They encouraged me to take it slowly. "You're allowed to explore without rushing to a conclusion," they said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "You're allowed to be uncertain." But uncertainty is not easy when you've built your entire identity on being dependable and comprehensible. I found myself thinking about my family. I imagined my father's face if I told him I sometimes dressed differently at home. I imagined the silence, the confusion, the attempt to fix it with a joke. I imagined my mother worrying that I was in danger, that I would be mocked, that I would be harmed. I imagined friends reacting with discomfort, or worse, with the kind of teasing that pretends to be harmless but is really a warning. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not because I was ashamed of Maya or ashamed of myself, but because I knew I needed to understand my own experience before inviting others into it. I started journaling privately, not with dramatic confessions, but with observations, what I felt, what triggered fear, what brought calm. I noticed that on evenings when I practiced presentation, I slept better. I noticed I was less reactive at work. I noticed I was kinder, not in a performative way, but in the quiet way that comes from having less internal war. I also noticed how much of my life had been built around avoiding ridicule. That's a strange thing to discover as an adult, that you are still living according to the rules of a playground, still making choices to avoid being the kid everyone points at. I began to see how that fear had shaped my friendships, my hobbies, even the way I decorated my home. I had treated normal as the highest form of safety. As months turned into a year, the practice became less about punishment and more about integration. Sometimes I would dress in a way that leaned more feminine just because I wanted to, not because I had misbehaved. That was the moment I truly understood what was happening. The system had started as a playful consequence for my stubbornness, but it had become a permission structure. It was a way to explore identity safely, deliberately, and with respect. Still, the tension of secrecy grew. It wasn't sustainable to build a private life that required constant compartmentalization. I didn't want to live a double life. I didn't want to lie. I also didn't want to throw myself into vulnerability without preparation. The ethical question wasn't just, what do I want? It was, how do I live truthfully without harming the people I love, including myself? The first person I told was not a friend. It was a therapist. That choice mattered. I wanted someone trained to hold complexity without turning it into a verdict. In the first session, I stumbled over language. I said things like, it's not sexual, and I don't know what it means, and I'm not trying to be dramatic. The therapist listened and said something simple. It sounds like you're describing an exploration of self-expression and identity, and it sounds like you're carrying a lot of shame that may not belong to you. That sentence landed in me like a weight dropping. Shame that may not belong to you. I realized how much of my discomfort came from inherited fear, from cultural scripts, from the way masculinity is often defined as the absence of softness. I didn't suddenly become fearless, but I began to separate my authentic feelings from the social penalties I'd been taught to expect. In therapy, I learned to ask better questions. Not, what label am I, but, what experiences make me feel whole? Not, how do I avoid judgment, but, what kind of life feels honest? Not, how do I convince others, but, how do I respect myself while respecting them? I also learned that self-exploration requires responsibility. It's not an excuse to demand endless accommodation. It's not a reason to ignore your partner's needs. It's not a license to retreat into fantasy. It's a commitment to self-awareness, to communication, to boundaries, to patience. Maya and I talked often, sometimes clumsily, about how the practice affected us. Maya admitted there were moments when they worried they'd pushed too hard, or when they worried I was using the system to avoid addressing deeper stress. I admitted there were moments when I felt dependent on the ritual to feel calm. We adjusted. We made sure it remained healthy, a tool, not a crutch. Eventually, the question of telling someone outside our home became unavoidable. It wasn't a dramatic outing. It was a slow decision. I chose one friend, someone I trusted, someone who had shown empathy in other conversations. I invited them over, made tea, and told them I had something personal to share. My voice shook. I said, I've been exploring my identity. Part of that has involved dressing in ways that are more feminine at home. It's helped me understand myself better. I'm not asking you to do anything with that information. I just don't want to hide it anymore. My friend's first reaction was a pause. That pause felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Then they said, thank you for trusting me. They asked a few respectful questions. They admitted they didn't know much about it. They didn't make it a joke. They didn't treat me like I'd confessed a crime. When they left, I sat on the couch and cried, not because it had gone perfectly, but because it had gone humanly. That conversation didn't solve everything. It didn't make the world safe. But it gave me evidence that my fear wasn't the only possible outcome. It also taught me something about empathy. Most people don't need you to be perfectly explained. They need you to be honest and considerate. The rest can be learned. Telling my family was harder. I waited until I felt stable enough to handle whatever happened. I didn't want to tell them in a moment of crisis. I didn't want to weaponize vulnerability. I chose a quiet weekend visit. I told Maya I might not come home feeling light. They hugged me and said, "Whatever happens, you're still you." When I sat with my parents, I didn't start with clothing. I started with emotions. I told them I'd been in therapy. I told them I'd been learning about myself. I told them I'd realized I'd spent years trying to be a version of myself that was easy for others. My mother listened with a worried tenderness. My father looked guarded, not angry but braced. I could see him trying to anticipate what kind of problem he was supposed to solve. Then I said, carefully, part of what I've been exploring is gender expression. Sometimes I dress differently at home. It's not a joke to me. It helps me feel more whole. I'm still me. I'm not asking you to understand everything immediately. I'm asking you to respect that this is real for me. There was silence. My father cleared his throat. My mother's eyes filled. She asked, "Are you okay?" Not as in, "Are you sick?" but as in, "Are you safe inside yourself?" I said, "I'm better than I've been in a long time." My father asked, bluntly, "Does this mean you're changing who you are?" I could have answered defensively. I could have given him a lecture. Instead I said, "It means I'm being more honest about who I've always been." He didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his hands, which were rough from years of work. He said, eventually, "I don't know what to do with this." I nodded. "You don't have to do anything. You just have to not make it cruel." That was the ethical line I held. I didn't demand celebration. I didn't demand instant fluency. I asked for basic respect. Over time, my mother adjusted faster. She asked questions. She said things like, "I don't want you to be hurt." I told her I didn't either, and that part of my responsibility was being thoughtful about where and when I expressed myself, not because it was shameful, but because the world still has risks. I spoke about boundaries. I spoke about consent. I spoke about the difference between private exploration and public confrontation. I spoke about mental health, about the relief of not fighting myself. My father took longer. He wasn't cruel, but he was uncomfortable. Sometimes he said nothing when the topic came up. Sometimes he changed the subject. Once, he made a joke that landed badly. I didn't explode. I said, quietly, "That hurts." He looked surprised, as if he'd forgotten I had an interior life. Later, he apologized in his own language, which was to fix something practical for me without being asked. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. During this time, I kept thinking about the punishment system and how it had shifted. What started as a teasing argument and a joking suggestion had become a structured dynamic of learning. The lessons in posture, presentation, and etiquette were never truly about femininity. They were about mindfulness. They were about humility. They were about how you treat people when you're stressed. They were about recognizing that control is not the same as strength. And yes, over time, I began to wonder whether I was being punished or reshaped into something I secretly enjoyed becoming. The answer turned out to be both simpler and deeper. I was being reshaped, but not by force. I was participating in my own reshaping. The system didn't create a hidden identity. It revealed a neglected one. I started to integrate what I'd learned into daily life. At work, I practiced listening. I practiced speaking without dominance. I practiced posture that communicated steadiness rather than aggression. I stopped using sarcasm as a shield. I became more aware of how often men are rewarded for taking up space without thinking, and how often women are expected to manage the emotional climate of a room. This wasn't about switching teams. It was about noticing the invisible labor of a presentation that some people are forced to master, and how much dignity can be found in choosing it rather than resenting it. Sometimes I would think about the word crossdressing and how loaded it can be. For some people, it's a simple hobby. For others, it's a step toward a deeper identity. For others, it's neither. It's a tool, a language, a way to explore. For me, it became a mirror. It showed me where I was rigid. It showed me where I was afraid. It showed me where I had internalized rules that didn't serve me. I also learned that authenticity is not a license to disregard others. There were moments when I wanted to push too fast, to make up for lost time by making bold declarations. But Maya reminded me, and therapy reinforced, that part of self-respect is pacing. If you demand that the world keep up with you instantly, you risk turning your healing into someone else's chaos. That doesn't mean you stay hidden forever. It means you choose your steps deliberately. The integration phase wasn't dramatic. It was a slow weaving. Some evenings, I dressed in a way that felt more aligned with the softness I'd always admired. I cooked dinner. I talked with Maya about our days. We practiced our little lessons not because I'd misbehaved, but because life is easier when you are mindful. Sometimes I didn't dress differently at all, and I still carried the lessons: gentleness, attentiveness, posture that held self-respect without arrogance. There were setbacks. There were days when a comment from a coworker or a news story or an overheard joke made me feel like retreating. There were days when I worried I was making things harder for myself for no reason. On those days, I returned to the question that had become my anchor: do I feel more whole when I allow myself this honesty? The answer was consistently yes. One of the most unexpected shifts was how my sense of empathy expanded. When you live with a hidden part of yourself, you become hyper-aware of how easily people are reduced to stereotypes. I started noticing the subtle ways society polices expression, the mockery, the suspicion, the casual cruelty disguised as humor. I also noticed the quiet courage of people who keep living anyway. I didn't become morally superior. If anything, I became more aware of my own past complicity. I remembered times I'd stayed silent when someone else was the target. I began making different choices, small ones, not laughing, changing the subject, speaking up when it mattered, being the person who makes the room safer rather than sharper. I'm not presenting this as a neat journey from confusion to enlightenment. Identity exploration is not a straight line. It's a practice, like posture. It requires awareness. It requires patience. It requires you to hold contradictory feelings without rushing to destroy one of them. I still have days when I feel fear. I still live in a world where not everyone is kind. But I no longer confuse fear with truth. If you're listening to this and seeing yourself in pieces of it, I want to offer a few things I wish someone had told me earlier. You are allowed to explore without punishing yourself. You are allowed to be uncertain without calling yourself broken. You are allowed to set boundaries that keep you safe. You are allowed to seek professional support. And you are responsible, always, for how you treat others while you learn. Your self-discovery should not become someone else's harm. Respect is not negotiable, not for you and not for the people around you. When I think back to that teasing argument in the kitchen, it almost makes me laugh how something so small became a turning point. But I've learned that turning points often arrive disguised as jokes because jokes are how we test the truth safely. Maya offered me a structure when I didn't have language. They gave me a way to practice being deliberate rather than reactive. And through that practice, I found a version of myself that had been waiting patiently behind the performance. I don't know what label fits me best, and I've stopped treating that as an emergency. I know that I am someone who values softness and strength, someone who sometimes expresses themselves through clothing that isn't traditionally assigned to my gender, someone who learned that control isn't the same as maturity, someone who is still learning. I know that my relationship grew stronger when we treated identity as something to understand rather than something to fear. I know that my mental health improved when I stopped living like my own curiosity was a threat. And I know that the most important transformation wasn't in the mirror. It was in my behavior. It was in how I listened. It was in how I apologized. It was in how I stopped using pride as protection. It was in how I began to inhabit my life with intention rather than obligation. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.